Lincoln as Emancipator. For some Americans, Abraham Lincoln remains the great emancipator, the man who freed the African American slaves. For others, Lincoln was an opportunist who lagged behind the abolitionist movement, an advocate for Black Americans' voluntarily immigration, and even white supremacists. Which is it? A fair answer requires that we evaluate Lincoln in the context of his time and the role in public. "I've always hated slavery as much as any abolitionist," Lincoln said in 1858. But when political opponent Stephen A. Douglas charged that Lincoln favored racial equality, he responded that, "I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equalities of the whites and Black races." Lincoln also attacked that counterfeit logic which presumed that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife. And shortly before signing the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the Confederate South, President Lincoln invited a visiting free Black delegation to consider immigrating to Haiti or Central America, saying, "It is better for both of us to be separated." To summarize this page, there are two sides to every story. Some think Lincoln was a great emancipator who wanted to free slaves. Others question why did it take him so long to stand for what he believed in, and he still had some white supremacy privileged ideas. So it's important to understand both sides. When he was running for president against Stephen A. Douglas, he was questioned on those two sides of the story. You say you want all people to be free, but you're also telling Black Americans that they need to move somewhere else because it's best to be separated. So you can see that there are some contradicting beliefs, but also at the core of his beliefs, he does feel that everyone should be equal. Many of Lincoln's actions are best understood by recalling that his chosen career was not morale profit, but instead, as a leading historian, James M. McPherson has written, a politician, a practitioner of the art of the possible, a pragmatist who subscribed to abolitionist principles, but recognized that they could be achieved in gradual step-by-step fashions through compromise and negotiation, in pace with progressive changes in public opinion and political realities. However, much Lincoln bowed to public opinion. He always held fast to a core belief that, under the Declaration of Independence, all men possessed equality and inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Lincoln also remained, for a man in the early and mid to 19th century, free of social prejudice. This is talking about how at first Lincoln was a politician. He was becoming the president, and he very much knew that making such a social change against prejudiced states in our country was going to take time. And so a lot of people thought he wasn't moving fast enough and that he really needed to get the people to back up his claim because he was a president for the people, those who believed some of his beliefs and those who did not. But again, at the end of the day, he really wanted to follow what the Declaration of Independence said, by possessing all men should be equal in their rights and liberty and pursuit of happiness, knowing that at this moment in time, this was not the case for all men. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American thinker, publisher, and abolitionist, met with Lincoln at the White House in 1864 and reported that, in his company, I was never in any way reminded of my humble origin or my unpopular color. The president had received Douglass just as you have seen one gentleman receive another. To summarize this page, when Frederick Douglass, who we've learned about before, met with President Lincoln at the White House in 1864 and very much felt as an equal person coming into the White House, it didn't matter the color of skin, the beliefs, or the life journey that either one of them had. He was received as a gentleman and felt very much that Lincoln was receiving him as an equal. The real issue defined. Before attaining the presidency, Abraham Lincoln's signature political issue was a determined opposition to the extension of slavery into the Western territories. The issue was for Lincoln a moral one. And in his final 1858 Senate campaign debate with Stephen A. Douglas, he made that point with a stunning clarity defined. the real issue, as a conflict on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery as wrong and of another class that does not look upon it as wrong. It is an internal struggle between two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. There are two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other is the divine right of kings. But Lincoln's ultimate political loyalty was to the Union. As the Civil War raged, Lincoln wrote, Horace Greeley, influential editor to the New York Tribune, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that." To the end, Lincoln allowed the slaveholding border states that sided with the Union to retain their slaves until the war ended. When the Union general took it upon himself to declare slavery abolished in parts of the South, the president swiftly rescinded the order, reserving to himself the authority for such an act. There's a lot going on in this paragraph, these two paragraphs, but to summarize the first one, Abraham Lincoln, during his last and final Senate debate with Stephen A. Douglas, who were both trying to become president during the time of the Civil War, there was a big struggle about what is right and what is wrong, and he wasn't taking a sure stand against slavery. He was saying that people think things are right sometimes and other people think things are wrong sometimes, and so that it can be very confusing, and he wasn't having his voice or his decision on equality come through in those speeches. However, when he was talking about to the New York Tribune, which is a newspaper, as the Civil War raged on, Lincoln was saying that his main objective was to save the Union, which was the states that embodied the northern part of our country, if you remember from A Nation Divided. So his ultimate goal was to save those states. He was the political leader of those states, and that was what he was protecting. He was not necessarily fighting to destroy slavery. He did not want it and wanted to see it go, but his ultimate goal was to make sure the Union was okay. He also did say that in the border states, so states that were touching the Confederacy part of the country as well as the Union part, could still keep their slaves until the end of the war, even though they were fighting to end slavery as a union, as the Union states. So he was very much kind of contradicting himself a little bit there. The problem from the perspective of Abraham Lincoln, the wartime political leader, was that Northern public opinion still was not ready for emancipation. But as the historian James Oakes had documented, Lincoln's rhetoric during the war's early years prepared the nation for that step. Even as he rescinded General David Hunter's May 1862 liberation order, Lincoln carefully included a paragraph asserting his authority to issue a similar one. In June, he began quietly to draft that order. In July, the Union Army stalled. The president quietly informed leading cabinet members that he now viewed emancipation as a military necessity. This was arguably quite true, and it was also politically shrewd. Enslaved blacks now comprised the majority of the Confederacy's labor force. Drawing them to the Union cause would simultaneously strengthen the Northern's war effort and weaken that of its Confederate opponent. Even as growing numbers of Northern whites came to support abolition, many who opposed it and fought only to preserve the Union could see how freeing slaves might decisive on the battlefield. So what these two paragraphs are talking about is that Abraham Lincoln, who knew that in the northern states, even though many believed slavery was wrong, weren't completely ready for the entire emancipation of all freed slaves. So he decided that this was an important next step for the Union states. So he began drafting what is now, as we know, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the paperwork and law that declared freedom for all African American slaves. It became a military act now, where military forces would go to the Confederate states and say that your slaves are now free and that this is what we are doing as a country. And what they were also considering is trying to promote that African American slaves in the Confederacy states who were working on the plantations or in the labor force would now come to the Union and fight in the Civil War for the Union side to fight for their freedom, and for others who couldn't fight for their freedom. A promise kept. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued what became known as the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It announced his intent on January 1st, 1863, to issue another order that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforth and forever free. With the new year, Lincoln kept his promise. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that all slaves within the Confederacy are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. It also announced the Union's intent to recruit and field black soldiers. So Lincoln kept his promise. He very much, in summary of this page, very much stated that all persons, slaves in all states, Confederate and Union, will now be free, and that they wanted to make sure that the military and naval authorities made sure that all the Confederacy states followed by this rule, and that they wanted the African American men and women to come to the Union and fight for their freedom. The future African-American leader, Booker T. Washington, was about 7 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation was read on his plantation. As he recalled in his 1901 memoir, Up from Slavery, as the great day grew near, there were more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder and had more ring and lasted later into the night. Most of the verses on the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. Some men who seemed to be stranger, a U.S. officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper. The Emancipation Proclamation, I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us that what it all meant, and that this was the day for which she had been for so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see. On the political front, Lincoln continued to defend emancipation on military grounds. No human power can subdue this rebellion without using the emancipation lever, as I have done, he wrote. If they, African Americans, stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, and the promise being made must be kept. Why should they give their lives for us with full notice of our purpose to betray them? I should be damned in time and in eternity for doing so. The world shall know that I will keep my faith to friends and enemies, come what will. So to summarize these two paragraphs, the first one is from Booker T. Washington's memoir, Up from Slavery. And it talks about how he remembers the day on the plantation when the military forces came and read the Emancipation Proclamation to all the slaves on the plantation, telling them that they were free to go and that slavery had ended for them, and the joy that it brought and the prayers that had been answered to many people who were slaves at that time. The second paragraph talks about how Lincoln, no matter what, said that he will keep his promise to the African Americans for their freedom if they come and fight for the same values and equal equality that he is fighting for on the Union side. And he will make sure that they will continue to stay free and keep his faith to his friends and his enemies on the Confederacy side, that it will happen for everyone. More than a decade after Lincoln's death, Frederick Douglass tried to explain Lincoln's relations to the cause of emancipation. Compared to the abolitionists, Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent, he wrote. but measure him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult. And Lincoln was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Perhaps no statesman could accomplish more. This is an extremely important paragraph, and I want to take it bit by bit to summarize. Abolitionists such as Harriet Tubman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass fought for something that they wanted and believed in hard and cold, and did whatever it took, no matter what, to make sure that they were free and that they continued to get the word out for freedom. So a lot of the abolitionists thought Lincoln was late to this fight, was cold and had no emotion around slavery, was indifferent and kind of went back and forth on what he thought. And part of that was because, one, he was not a slave and had the privileges of being a white man in power. However, what Frederick Douglass is saying is that we have to judge Lincoln by what he was doing and where he was. He was the president or becoming president of a country. He had to think for all people. And even though some people thought he was late to this fight, he was actually gradually trying to figure out the best way to turn an entire country and guide them into thinking that all men should be created equal, and that to bring military forces in to make sure that that was actually happening. So he said he was swift and zealous and radical and determined for his time, even though many others did not agree with him, and that it just took him more time to fight for the equality of all.